Everyone, good evening, good morning, good day, whatever time of the day you happen to be watching this. It is Monday night, November 22nd, 2021. You are watching Disputed Lands. Thanks for being here. Stick along, it's going to be a good ride.
Well, just because you have an understanding of the Bible in your head doesn't necessarily mean that you have Jesus in your heart.
Get right, get inside, get hungry, got appetite. Everlasting water, never again thirsty. To disputed lands, take a journey.
You are listening to Chad SCHAFER on Disputed Lands.
You're getting another one this week. Hello, hello, hello. Oh, and my guest just left the room. Well, it's just me right now. I'm sure Dr. Judd Burton will be back, and my face is now really huge on the screen because he left. I'm on the wrong scene. Here he is. He's back.
I'm back.
Ladies and gentlemen, I give to you my guest for his return, short returning, was on just a couple of weeks ago, or a few weeks ago, Dr. Judd Burton. I can now say, not only is he my special guest and friend, but he's now also my professor because I'm going to school at IBA. So I've got all kinds of good reasons to be happy tonight. But tonight we're going to dive in to a topic that is very dear and near to Dr. Judd Burton's heart because of the research he's put into it, I think very early on in his career. And I don't think he's been able to share this in too many places. And it really is going to be a treat to sit back and listen to this. I'm not going to do a lot of talking. As I told him, I'm going to let him go with his presentation of material, and I may interject a question or with a thought a time or two, but we're going to just, all of us, sit back and relax, grab your coffee. I have mine right here in my Through the Black cup. And
have mine.
You got yours? Got yours?
Got mine in the old.
I'll interject now and then so you can take a drink.
Okay, very good.
All right, sounds good. Well, Judd, the stage is yours, brother. Where do we start?
Well, I wish I could say a long, long time ago in a galaxy far, far away, but unfortunately that line has already been taken. But it's the same kind of auspiciousness, I think. We could definitely do a screen crawl to set this up if it were a movie.
Mm-hmm.
But no, we go back to a place in northern Israel, Mount Hermon. At a time before the flood, at a point which we could probably safely say is sometime after the initial satanic coup in heaven, in which a group of 200 Watcher class angels descended on Mount Hermon, and most of the audience will be familiar without having to retread old tires, so to speak, the Genesis 6 event that ensued at Mount Hermon. And I'll come back to that. But on the southwestern slope of Mount Hermon is a site known today as Paneas. Paneas is the Arabic rendering of Paneas, the Greek name of the site, and many students of the Bible will recognize this place as Caesarea Philippi in the New Testament. There was a brief tenure in which Herod Philip rebuilt and sort of revitalized the city, and it was known as Caesarea Philippi for a time during the first century. And that's certainly the name that dawned the city when Jesus and his disciples came through, which you can read about in Matthew chapter 16 and Mark chapter 8. But this visit to Caesarea Philippi by Jesus and his disciples would seem to be a kind of somewhat uneventful stop, were it not for the statements that he made, and especially those statements being made against the backdrop of such a significant cultural fixture, religious fixture in the minds of the first century Jews. And that all has to do
Uh-oh, he froze. We'll give him a second.
heavily with the okay.
Yeah, you froze quite a bit there. You said with the back, and then we lost you.
Okay. Yeah, I was talking about the cultural backdrop of the Mount Hermon region and Caesarea Philippi, where Jesus goes to make these very significant founding theological statements against the backdrop of the Genesis 6 event, ground zero, if you will, for the descent of the Watchers and the creation of their progeny, the giants and the chimera of the pre-flood world, the Nephilim. But it behooves us to know something about the history of this region. Not that we won't touch on elements of the Mark 16, Matthew 16, Mark chapter 8 visit of Jesus at Caesarea Philippi, but we need to know something about the sacred geography and the history of Paneas and the region of Mount Hermon to set the stage, so to speak, for this story. And most people who have studied this topic for any length of time are undoubtedly familiar with the association of Paneas, Caesarea Philippi, with the Greek god Pan. In fact, that's where Paneas derives its name. You'll note that the first portion of that name is Pi Alpha Nu, or Pan, Pan. Pan, in fact, is really only the Greek and then the Greco-Roman face of what I believe to be an older entity that going all the way back into prehistory during this time when the Watchers came down in the days of Jared, as the book of Enoch relates to us. This was sort of a ball of yarn that I began to unwind as I began my dissertation research, and arguably it started before that with my archaeological work, my on-the-ground archaeological work at the site itself, in which I not only learned the rudiments of archaeology, specifically Near Eastern archaeology, but also in the weeks and months leading up to that initial expedition, I familiarized myself with the apocryphal literature that related to Mount Hermon, the Paneas region, and of course reacquainted myself with the Genesis 6 material and the other references to those events found throughout the Bible. And it occurred to me, working in the shadow of what locals have for decades called the Gray-Haired Mountain, that there had to be some relationship between the shrine to Pan, around which the city of Paneas grew, and a string of similar deities that came from various cultures in the region, stretching all the way back to the Watchers. One Watcher specifically, who I think may have been the original face of Pan. And I think that the glaring identity there is probably Azazel. I think that there's a good case to be made for just on linguistic grounds and cultural grounds that this was the initial face of Pan. Azazel's name literally means the goat of God, and most people will be familiar with Azazel through the atonement ritual outlined in Leviticus, in which a goat is not sacrificed to Azazel, but it's the nation of Israel's sin that is placed on the goat, and it's dispatched in a manner similar in which Azazel was imprisoned. But Azazel was one of the high-ranking watcher angels, arguably a lieutenant, if not the lieutenant, of Semyaza, those personalities that are outlined to us in the book of Enoch. And he is in charge, essentially, of teaching a combination of warcraft and metallurgy, and on the one hand, and witchcraft and seduction on the other, or at least a type of witchcraft. The sentence that's handed down to him by God through Enoch relates that all sin is to be ascribed to Azazel, because he revealed these mysteries of heaven that were not to be revealed yet. So there's definitely a kind of manipulation of heavenly knowledge for nefarious ends, which we might call a kind of witchcraft, kind of sorcery. So there are these kind of mystical elements to Azazel, and also military aspects as well. And these are traits that are echoed in later iterations of Azazel, including Pan. If you read much of the mythology of Pan, you learn quickly that he's probably one of the older gods. He assisted the Olympians in the defeat of the Titans, and his the Ix, the goat-hided shield that Zeus often carries with him. Pan had a role in apparently making that. And of course, Pan also had a very terrifying war cry that just paralyzed people. That's where we get the word panic from Pan, because of this terrifying cry that Pan allegedly had. And Pan was associated with all kinds of oracular visions and divination and dreams. People would sleep in his temples in the ancient world to try and derive Pan's will. And so there's definitely a supernatural element, a mystical component to Pan that's reminiscent of some of these earlier deities. But it seems clear to me that you're looking at the recycling of sacred space over years, because of the initial significance of Mount Hermon, and the Paneas phase is just one phase of that. So if Azazel is the original face of Pan, what do you fill in the gaps of thousands of years between that and the arrival of Pan? Because it's really not until the Seleucids, the descendants of one of actually the descendants of two of Alexander the Great's generals. It's not until the Seleucids and the Ptolemies come through the region that part of the world begins to take on a more Hellenic aspect, a more Greek aspect. And when the Ptolemies, who had control over that region first, came through in the third century, they saw this cave there that had been used by other cultures as a place to give votive offerings and perform all kinds of rites. They saw this cave as auspicious, that it was a natural haunt, and they interpreted the god worship there as the god Pan, the god of the wilderness and grottos and caves, and of shepherds and goatherds. And that's where this Greek appellation, this Greek name, was given to the region. The Paneon is what it was called initially. But it didn't take long before the Ptolemies and the Seleucids were fighting over this part of the world, and the Seleucids defeated the Ptolemies at a battle around 200 BC, not terribly far from the later site of Paneas. And the Seleucids became the stewards of that part of Israel for quite a long time before the Romans arrive in the middle of the 1st century BC. So what do you fill in? Because that's a lot of space to fill in there. That's a lot of history between Azazel and the Greek period, the Hellenic period.
Yeah.
What goes in between all of that time? What are these other faces of Pan? Well, there are certainly a lot of characters, and by characters, I'm of course talking about the personalities of the deities worshipped by a lot of the regional cultures that line up very, very nicely with the traits of Pan. Probably amongst the earliest were these almost animistic gods, but I suppose you could say that they were theriomorphic or anthropomorphic in some ways, because they were associated with herds of animals, particularly goats or goat and sheep. There were regional Semitic deities known as the Odds or the Uds, which again is that Semitic root that we find in Azazel's name that means goat. But we also have really a palette of earlier deities, or not earlier deities, but period deities, such as those that were worshipped by the peoples of Mesopotamia, specifically the Amorite Babylonians. And of course, the Amorites had land that they actually ruled over the region of the Hermon range, which would have included Paneas or Paneas. You'll hear me using those words interchangeably, but it's the same place. But of course, the Amorites were in control of that territory for quite some time, and they worshipped a number, or at least acknowledged a number of goat deities. One of them, the namesake of the Amorites, the Moru, who was a shepherd deity. You also had in later Mesopotamian peoples like the Assyrians, who no doubt were acknowledging this goat deity as something that had come before. The Bennu was a demon in the Assyrian pantheon, who was clearly satyr-like. He had the human torso, the kind of goat head and beard, the cloven hooves, the hind legs of a goat, and he also had a forked serpentine tongue as well. And as a matter of fact, it was just a few years ago, I think, that archaeologists found a cave in Assyrian territory in Iraq that included a depiction of Bennu and incantations to either placate or drive him away. So even Bennu's name is phonetically similar to Pan, and I'll get into some of the Eastern influences on Pan in a moment ago. That's a very quantifiable thing. It's not something that's just conjecture. But Bennu's name, because P sounds and B sounds fall into the same consonant category in languages, there's a lot of, and you can play a little fast and loose with the vowels in Semitic and ancient Near Eastern languages, and of course the presence of the N there is very telling, I think, because you not only do all the features line up in congruity, but you've got linguistic similarity as well. There's also Adzaga, a Mesopotamian deity who's is goat-like in form, and these, of course, these were worshipped over the course of the thousands of years that the Mesopotamians, in their various incarnations, from the Sumerians, the Akkadians, the Amorite Babylonians, the Assyrians, and the later Neo-Babylonians, who worshipped and revered and acknowledged a panoply of these kinds of entities, creatures, and deities. And of course, there were all kinds of lesser sort of demigod creatures, chimerical creatures in the Levant. Even the Bible references the Shethim, who were the satyrs of that region. And, usually when you run into that word in places like Isaiah chapter 34, it's usually translated as he-goats. But to clarify, these are very much satyr creatures within ancient Hebrew belief. They're a specific kind of demon that the ancient Hebrews and the ancient Levantines believed in. So there's a lot of cultural exchange, cultural sharing going on here. But this is what you fill in that gap between biblical prehistory and the coming of the Greek influence in the East, are these Mesopotamian and Levantine deities and demons and entities who are basically incarnations of the god that later became known as Pan. I think that's what you're looking at here in terms of the ensconcement of that particular deity at Paneas.
I'm going to let you take a drink of your coffee and
okay.
Here, what seems to me interesting is that regardless of cultural influence or who may have been in control of the area, you would expect to see what happens here. Okay, so I'll just give a simple example. There's a piece of land and it has a barn that's in pretty bad shape. Now, most people, if you had the money to buy the barn, and it's in bad shape, it's in ruins, you're not going to spend the extraordinary amount of money to fix what's there, because oftentimes, then as it was now, it was much harder to fix something that's there to make it useful, rather than especially if it's mostly fallen in or down, or with these, you raise it and you put up your imagination or your idea or your purpose for the land. And the same thing goes with, I think, you would naturally think with religion, that they would worship their, let's say that's such obviously a religious center like this, they would worship their God and their manner. My point is this, is they did not change the characteristics of what was worshipped. Everybody who was in control or around the area worshiped there, but they didn't change the characteristics of the God, little g God, that was being worshipped.
Right.
Which is what you would expect to happen if there wasn't a shared knowledge among them. Yes,
and that's that's not something that's unique to Paneas. It happens all over the ancient world. The Greeks and the Romans were famous for doing that. They would conflate their deities with the regional deities in their respective empires. And they would acknowledge that they were the same ones because they had basically the same features.
Yeah, it was simply a recognition of it. Maybe they incorporated, other attributes. This would be not new information, but a form of boast, I guess, maybe, to do so. But they just said, "Oh yeah, that's it. that's this one. And they had no problem doing so. They had
Mhm.
no issues with that. When
Mhm.
you think of religious fervor, and especially how we view our Father and our God, which we have
Mhm.
a right to, as the God of all gods.
Mhm.
But you feel in your religious zeal and that knowledge of not he's beyond comparison. Um, I don't know. It just seems weird to me how easily and they were able to incorporate other cultures.
Mhm.
It just
Well, yeah, we have to remember too that in many cases they were engineers of these cultures.
mm,
And so there's a variable there that I like to call ethnodemonology, that they could, demonic entities could fit in to whatever pantheon in any culture, because they were either responsible for its original creation anyway and could easily play act, or B, because there is a natural progression of culture and language. There is
hmm
a natural
sure.
progression. They could fit into later iterations of those cultures just as easily. And this is something that I'm fleshing out in my preternatural morphology coursework, with the manifestation of demons as vampires and werewolves and chimera and all kinds of things, zombies, revenants, ghouls, these later sort of mythical creatures from folklore, uh, which demons are able to manifest as, or wear the mask, if you will, of these sorts of creatures. It's the same sort of logic applied to what we're talking about now in the ancient world, that these entities were able to assume the role in these respective pantheons, regardless of what culture they were entering in. Because, as I've said a number of times, when asked, well, how is it that demons and these dark entities can do this? I said, well, because they have millennia on all of us. They've been studying much, much longer than we have. Plus, they're heirs to whatever knowledge was given in the pre-flood world to the Watchers, and so they're the calculus that they're using to carry out all this stuff is extra dimensional. It's beyond
Well,
the physics of our realm in many ways.
yeah. So a couple of thoughts of that. Now, I believe the spirits, the evil spirits that dwell the earth, to be the fallen giants. Do you agree
Hmm.
with that? Okay.
Yeah, I think linguistically that there can't really be a case made otherwise. I think.
Yeah, and they are real, by the way. So
Yes.
yeah,
Yes.
yeah. Um, Now the second thing I wanted to point out is something that uh, again comes from the research I did into David Flynn's work, is that, and you will find it probably when he's talking about the crop circle phenomenon in any of
Hmm.
his talks or whatever. He said something there that there seems to be a class of them that speaks solely in a mathematical term, but
Hmm.
I would say that there is an order to all of them in a manner that shares a consistent or constant story, even if it seems to be um, uh, abnormal or abhorrent or
Hmm.
whatever to us. That there is a purpose behind it to direct thought,
Hmm.
whether consciously or subconsciously.
Hmm.
And I don't know if that has anything to do with our conversation here. It's just these are the things that come to mind to me when I hear about this. And you know, there was a progression and an order to, even though the faces changed, as you mentioned, the
Hmm.
characteristics didn't. The name did. The characteristics didn't. Maybe there was a different face depending on the culture inhabiting it at the time, but it doesn't mean that the information that was meant to be conveyed by it did change.
Hmm.
If I can say, if I if that made any sense
Sure.
to anybody who listened at all.
Yeah, well, it's interesting you bring up David Flynn's work. I think he's right. I think that there is, if in a way you can sort of reduce language to a kind of mathematics. It is a kind of calculus. It does follow patterns. It does follow trends. And so at the end of the day, it can be reduced to kind of ones and zeros. So I think that there's definitely some truth in that, and it's sort of like them having the Rosetta Stone, that them being the demonic entities, because they may have studied for millennia, but they also have the advantage of being able to understand knowledge, various kinds of knowledge, including language and culture, with the same kind of sophistication that the Watchers did, because they're heirs to those techniques, if you will. So yeah, there's definitely some tie-in there, and to your other point about the demons being disembodied spirits of the Nephilim, I think that quite frankly, I'm shocked that's even debated on theological and linguistic terms anymore. I'm a big fan of just letting the words say what they say, and you can't wring you can't look at something like the judgment that's handed down to the Nephilim in, let's say, the Book of Enoch, that there'll be unclean spirits that will roam the earth. Well, one of the most prevalent descriptors and depictions of demons in the New Testament is the phrase unclean spirit. I don't know how much clearer of a line can be drawn.
Well, I can tell you, number one, people who defer with this or want to make arguments against it, number one, have never met one. I have.
Yeah.
To them, there is simply the terrors. If you've met one, there's no mistaking the spirit, or in the scripture, I think uses the countenance of them. When they went into the land and they were there, it says, and the countenance of them. Well, when we read that in English and you think, oh, the countenance, how they look, how they appear. It's like, you don't get it. You just really don't get it unless you've run into one.
Yeah.
No, it's they were terrible. I mean, where our word arrives. Terrible is much watered down in our culture now. The use of it, oh, that was just terrible. Well, it had a much more impactful meaning to them. And I think if we have that kind of thought, if anybody here thinks of terror, okay, I was in absolute terror, or I was then you can begin to get a glimpse of the awe and the power that these priests and these people really ascribed to this god Pan, or Paneas. This is how they thought of them in their cultures.
Yeah, clearly. I mean, there phrase after phrase in the passage after passage in the Old Testament talks about how they were certainly anthropomorphic, but there was something different about them. Some of the clues come from the words used to describe them. As buzzers and long-necked and wraiths and dead ones and frighteners and terrifiers. There's something of the exotic in these words that sets them slightly off of what you would expect to encounter in a human, in other words. Something that was purely human. So yeah, I have no doubt, and that's certainly retained. Those qualities are retained in the demonic form. It
Yeah,
you know
I didn't
it
want
is. Go ahead.
I didn't want to carry us away from the conversation of just simply learning about this, but I think it's important to understand, not only just to engage our minds and our thoughts and gain some learning here, but we really, I think, do need to feel the impact of this place, um, both there and as you've been pointing out, you know, the anthropology of it
Hmm.
into our cultures even today.
Hmm.
Um, has not changed. It's a different. We're using these different terms, but it's really conveying the same understandings that they always have,
Hmm.
and this is where it began. So I think it's important to both acknowledge it with our heads, but we gotta. I think it's important to feel it with our hearts and our
Right.
as
Right.
well.
I agree. I mean, it's relevant. I don't think it's too far off the beaten track in terms of the history of Paneas and the Mount Hermon region. It has everything to do with that. Um, the the there's so much in terms of the legacy and the residues of that event that are present, in the later iterations of Bonias. It's likely one of the places where, there were a number of Baals that were worshipped in the Hermon region too. Most of the Canaanite peoples had their regional interpretations of Baal. One of them was actually called the Baal Hermon. And it's thought by scholars that the Baal Hermon certainly was worshipped in the Hermon range, and there are remnants of high places throughout the range. And certainly the Baal Gad was one of the regional Baals that was worshipped, and so you've got a whole, even outside of just the strict sort of goat imagery, a lot of times the Baals were represented by the virility and potency of the bull imagery. Any number of Canaanite high-ranking male deities like El and Baal were both represented by bulls, and so there's that horned creature element, that's also retained in the later iterations of this entity at Paneas. And as you say, this is ground zero. This is where that corruptive force began its work, and it's why once we get to talking about some of the theological importances of the Caesarea Philippi episode in Jesus' ministry, that a lot of this stuff begins to pop to life and take on new meaning. That is those events that transpire in the Caesarea Philippi episode during Jesus's ministry, because of all of these ancient and prehistoric elements that are at play in the backdrop here, with the mountain itself, Mount Hermon, with the fact that in Jesus's day, Paneas or Caesarea Philippi at the time was the Greco-Roman capital of the region, and the entire Temenos against the red cliffs on that southwestern slope. The Temenos would have been the sacred sanctuary, the sacred portion of the city where all of the temples were, where you had not only the grotto, the cave, which was Pan's temple, but there was a tetrastyle temple in front of it. You had shrines to the nymphs, including nymphs like Nemesis. There was an Asclepion, a healing oracular center dedicated to the god Asclepios. So there were any number of deities that were acknowledged and worshipped there. So you've got this pagan backdrop against which Jesus is making these statements. You're in the old kingdom of Bashan, which at the time was Latinized to Batanea. And Bashan, of course, for students of the Bible, you'll remember this was the kingdom of Og, the last of the Rephaim. Plus, you got to the west, you have a land that was allotted to the apostate tribe of Dan, and they were apostate and likened to snakes. And so you've got all of this stuff at play and working while Jesus is making these rather foundational theological statements for the church and the not just the church there, but the body of Christ in general throughout all the world over time. And he's saying that, at this place. And like I say, we'll take that deep dive next time. But I'll say this about it. I've been asked if I could succinctly tell somebody why the giants are important, in just a brief statement. My response is typically 2 words: Caesarea Philippi. Because if Jesus was concerned about this and he chose this place to make all these statements, I think that's very, very significant. And I'm not the only one who's touched on that. I did in my dissertation work. I wrote about it in Paneas. I touched on it in an interview with a giant. Dr. Heiser has written on it. He wrote a wonderful book called Reversing Hermon that deals with a lot of the same kinds of issues. He and I have sort of been pulling at these threads, of the same tapestry over the years, and there's still a whole lot more to uncover. But you're definitely looking at the recycling of sacred space here, and when I say sacred space or sacred geography, these are scholarly terms. I'm not talking about a sacred place like believers would sacralize a place, like Christians would, but we're talking about religious activity, religious ideology in the same place over a span of time. That's how sacred geography in the mundane world basically gets created. It's a basic anthropological concept that runs throughout all of the humanities and social sciences, and it's kind of the approach that I took to the religious history of Paneas when I wrote my dissertation.
Yeah, I want to say something about that, because I wrote my book briefly about this. David Flynn wrote about this.
Sure.
And there's a question that somebody asked that relates to this. So, you've heard, that phrase "as above, so below," that's associated with Masonry. But they really borrow that from simply observation of ancient cultures, building places in alignment with the stars that were in the heavens. We know this because of the Great Pyramids and their alignment with the Orion's belt, and their placement being mathematically impossible to our minds that such an ancient people could do such a thing to describe on the face of the earth. But it wasn't just those structures that did this. All of the premier or most ancient of cities are constructed in such a way that they mirror the heavens, and they are aligned with heavenly bodies and places and regions, the most holy being those that are most perfectly aligned mathematically with their appropriate placed in the Mazzaroth, or the zodiac, if you want to use a modern term, the constellations. And the reason for that is to have a physical representation of that which is a spiritual reality or unseen reality. So this is something that I had studied and came to understand only through experience that I had, that it finally made sense to me why that is. But somebody had asked, do you believe that this place is a active portal now? And my only answer to that is, what kind of portal? I cannot say. I can tell you that for whatever reason that is, that these spiritual entities, for whatever reason, do have to follow some physical rules. More modern myth tells you about the lore of vampires, let's say, how they cannot enter your home unless they are welcomed in.
Mm-hmm.
You think of this as myth, and as it's like, where does that originate, or why does that originate? Well, they have to use for whatever reasons, and I can only tell you this from my own testimony, is that when I told the thing to leave my house, the thing didn't go through a wall. It left by the door, though it went through the door.
Mm-hmm.
So why that had to be, or whether our understanding is there as to why this has to be, but there are laws at work and at play for the reasons these things are the way they are. There is a
Mm-hmm.
reason why they constructed them where they did.
Mm-hmm.
So when you talk about, are there portals, are there places? Yes, they are, but they've not changed. They're always in the same places that they've always been. It's why it's important to understand what took place there. All these things, because yes, they do exist, but whether one is there now, if to answer that question, is there a portal there? Yeah, I would say yes, there is, but it's not above. It's not one that
Mm-hmm.
goes above.
Mm-hmm.
It's one that goes to below where the prison is.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and I think that's when Jesus makes his statements about the gates of hell not prevailing against his church, that was one of the Phoenician designations, and Christ is alluding to that in this particular homily, but that was one of the Phoenician designations for that particular grotto, the gates of hell. And I think you rightly point out that there are both supernatural and natural laws that are at play here, and I cannot but think, because there have been several earthquakes that since antiquity have sealed off the back of that cave. It used to be that that you could drop a tow line into the back of the cave, and it would never reach a bottom, according to the accounts. But as I say, there have been any number of earthquakes that have literally pulled rock off of the cave ceiling and have sealed those entrances into the lower chambers of the cave, so that it doesn't actually go back that deep now. But in my mind, yeah, I think it is one of a number of portals, or the people of the region, and certainly Christ putting the sort of exclamation point on the whole issue. I tend to think that it is, and that adds another layer of meaning to what we're going to talk about in the second part of this series. If you look at caves in mythology in general, there's always some weird stuff going on them in terms of religious history. You've got the birth and nurturing of gods. Caves were in the ancient world, they were all thought to be entrances to the underworld. They often were used as places of oracular vision and divination, and temples in and of themselves, not just by the Greeks and the Romans, but ancient peoples all over the world. And so, Muhammad, again, allegedly receives his dictation from this angel that's supposed to be Jabril, which odd place to be dictating a new revelation of God in the midst of this subterranean passage, this cave. So that's why I say that this is a trend that you can sort of quantify in the history of religions, that caves often do represent portals, and in many cases I think are literally portals between this world and the netherworld. That's certainly what ancient peoples believed.
Yeah, it's believed, practiced. Um, it's an actuality for those who were their priests. They did have a knowledge of about these things and an understanding that I believe in some people is still probably present. I'm thankful that some of that was graciously lost
Hmm.
in some ways. I think much to, but we can see today, just as there is an explosion of the seeming technology, we can see
Hmm.
today that well, it wasn't that long ago. We saw an outbreak of what was this drug that was being used that was driving people absolutely mad.
Oh, the bath salt stuff.
Yeah, the bath salts.
Yeah.
Bath salts, people.
Hmm.
I mean, the etymology of that word alone that is being used harkens back to what we're talking about today. If you know the etymology of bath,
Hmm.
so all these things are connected. Uh, yeah, absolutely. Sacrifice blood played a part. We had a question, about children and demonology and all these things. By the way, this is a good time so Dr. Burton can take more sips of his coffee. You can go to, I've been scrolling it across the screen. Burton Beyond is one, but Tobia.org is the one you want to go to. Now, I put a link on Facebook, and there are some people who says it don't work. I tried it for my mobile phone, and you're correct. Facebook blocks it and gives you a 404 error. So what you
Huh.
really need to do is you need to go directly to the web page or your web browser and type it in as Tobia.org to
That
get there.
that may actually have something to do with the updates that I'm doing on the site right now.
Yeah, and
Um,
so it
to
may be down from time to time because he is updating.
right.
But he has many courses, and I think it expires in just a couple days. Um,
Well, but get ready because there's going to be more stuff this week. So
okay,
there'll,
so
there'll be more deals this week.
there's more deals this week coming. Uh, I know that many people are interested. I know at least one person in the chat and one person in my Disputed Lands prayer group has also signed up for his class. There are 4 classes to choose from. Just go to his website. It tells you all about it, tobia.org, and you will not be disappointed. This is an opportunity to learn from somebody who knows the stuff. It's somebody we know. It's somebody you can talk to. You sign up for the class. Well, just there's opportunity here for you that has not been available, at least to me, on this level. It's a personable level. If you go to many other places outside of IBA, um, you're that for academics or study, the level even at Christian schools today is similar to that of any of the public educational, higher educational places where there is not that personal connection or level. Um, it's just not the case here. Now, as more people sign up, that becomes less and less. And we are praying that Dr. Burton gets to a place where he can get help. We would love that
Yeah.
to expand what he does, but it is a much more personal level. It's somebody you can trust, and I highly encourage anybody who's considerate to look at this seriously. Tobia.org and see if these things and these topics if we're talking about interest you tonight. There's something you want to find more of about. Why not study it as a discipline? It makes no sense to me why you would not.
Yeah. If folks are interested, they can email me tonight if they want to, or whenever they listen to the program, and I can send you a breakdown of all the programs that we have. And I all this material is pertinent to not just the history and the culture of the Bible and the context of the Bible, but it's timely too, because there are some definite demonological components to what I'm teaching, and they relate directly to the times that we live in right now. I don't. That's why I keep saying that I don't think that there's been a time in history where it's been more important to be an ardent student of the Scripture, and its vigorous application. And I think I have a unique perspective on that, and I want to help people do just that.
Yeah, I don't know if this is a good stopping point for part one or not. Believe it or not, Jed, we've been talking already almost for an hour, just underneath an hour.
I mean to tell you, yeah.
I
think we've laid the groundwork pretty well here. People have a pretty decent, I think, from my description here, because what I wanted to bring to the fore was this continuation, this sort of recycling of sacred space and these religious ideas that centered around this entity. And I think that's a very important component of the religious history of Paneas, in order to understand what we're going to talk about in the next series. So I think a good place to start will be with, because when you get to the point where Jesus is entering, you're entering into the Roman phase of the site. And so we'll talk, we can start with Josephus's accounts in the Wars of the Jews, and then go into the material of the actual episode, the Caesarea Philippi episode, and I'll close it out with a kind of synopsis of what's happened at Paneas in the wake of all of these events, and why it continues to be an important site.
Please do. Yeah. Next week, I actually have scheduled, who just entered the chat a little bit ago, Nate, Fire for Truth is how we know him. I do have him scheduled for next week. So unless he wants to move back a week, we won't have you back again for 2 weeks for that part two.
Okay, that's fine.
But unless that's an issue for you.
No, not at all. I mean, if anything, it'll give people a chance to dive into this material for themselves and kind of check out the stuff that I've done, on the site, scholarship itself. And if I could recommend anything right now, it would be the little book, which is a kind of distillate of my dissertation, called Paneas, which will give you some more details about the site. Yeah.
So his if you go to that Tioba, what does that stand for, by the way?
The Institute of Biblical Anthropology.
If you go to there and go to the bookstore, he does have booklets available for sale.
Probably, and it's probably easier to just go to the lulu.com bookstore in order to get those. But actually, this week, everything in my catalog's 15% off if you enter Turkey 15 in the checkout. So you could nab Paneas pretty quickly if you feel led to do that. Any of those purchases you make help fund what the Institute is doing.
What's the Lulu address?
If folks go to lulu.com and just do a search for my name, they'll come up with my author profile, and it'll bring the store up.
Okay, there you go, folks. So any of these booklets, if you want a quick reference, Paneas, I've been reading through the booklet Paneas, and I think I saw Ian Chadrick in the chat saying, "Man, I eat this stuff up." Well, brother, me too. I've got I can't screen share because it's on my other computer over here, but I got highlights going up and down this Paneas thing of stuff that this stuff really gets me going. And
Yeah, and I think there's a chapter in there called "The Many Faces of Pan" that I think probably relates directly to what I've been talking about tonight. That I think readers and listeners will probably enjoy quite a bit. So there's a lot in there. There's a detailed study of some of the major inscriptions, many of which relate to the religious and ritual significance of the site. And then there's just something in there that my hope is that people will look at the Caesarea Philippi episode in Jesus's ministry in a whole new light, that it will just pop to life in a whole new way.
Yeah, I want to point out that also that Caesarea Philippi and where this is marks the northern extent of Yeshua's ministry when he was on the earth, and it's 33 degrees right on the latitude above the center point of Jerusalem. I'm sure it's all just a coincidence.
Yeah, the fact that that Mount Hermon itself lies directly on the 33rd latitude. There's probably no accident there.
No, I don't.
None whatsoever.
So. Yeah. All right. Well, Dr. Burton, I'm gonna say this is a good place for us to stop. We'll pick up the part 2 here in a couple weeks. Man, this time flies by. I wish I could talk to you for hours and hours, but not everybody can focus for that long. So we'll have to cut it short here. Thank you to everybody who's joined us in the chat. I remind you to, if you would, share this wherever you have social media connections, to click that like button while it's still there and I guess matters before they take it away. But please do share it to all the platforms, share it with your friends. Talk about these things when somebody's asking you why are you so deep in thought, and say, well, I was just thinking about the show I watched earlier this week and some of the things that are going on there. And they say, oh, yeah, why? I said, well, just go to Take on the World TV and look for Judd Burton. And that's all you got to do. It's real easy. And they can like it and come here. But we love you, brother. And we'll talk to you here again real soon. My name's Chad SCHAFER. It's Disputed Lands. This is Take on the World TV. Till we see you next week.
Get right, get inside, get hungry, word of God appetite. Everlasting water, never again thirsty. To disputed lands, take a journey. Observe, interpret, and apply. Detoxify from demon doctrines, get edified. Fight the good fight, stop getting lied to. The kingdom of heaven is inside you.
Holy Spirit guide you.
Mortify your flesh by the scripture magnified. Applied what's amplified, dead corpse gets electrified. Dry bones get flesh, yelling the battle cry.
To die is gain, to live is right.
Oh yeah, you know that's right. We in this together, grab somebody's hand and hold tight. Study God's word until the world blurs. Fight evil with God's word as the world burns. Holding steadfast as it all crashes and burns. Cause whom devils disturb are preserved by God's word. That's word. Get right, get inside, get hungry, word of God appetite. Everlasting water, never again thirsty. To disputed lands, take a journey. Get right, get inside, get hungry, word of God appetite. Everlasting water.